Hi, welcome to Progress Toronto's third Future of Our Cities series panel, Defunding the Police, a discussion on reprioritizing our city's investments as we build a just Toronto. My name is Saman Tabasi-Nijad, and I am the project manager here at Progress Toronto. And we're so excited to welcome so many of you here tonight. Thousands signed up to hear this amazing panel speak on this very important and timely issue. Many folks are joining us from all across Turtle Island, so we're going to be acknowledging the land that we are situated on here in Toronto, but in the chat, please share the land and territory that you are on right now. We want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathering today on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and that Toronto is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with many Mississauga and Chippewa bands. As we meet here today, let us renew and strengthen our commitment to reconciliation based on respect, partnership, and action to build a stronger, more resilient, and more equitable city. Before we officially begin the panel, I want to give you some ground rules and give you an overview of the features we're going to be using tonight here on the Zoom. So first, the chat is enabled so that you can message everyone and the panelists. And we encourage you to use the chat throughout the panel to introduce yourself, where you're from, and what you're excited to hear about tonight. But please note, we will be monitoring the chat and looking out for anything that is offensive. Secondly, we will be polling you throughout the panel. Your answers to the polls are anonymous, and the polls will just pop up on your screen. And you can always close the polls close the pop-up if you want to, but we do encourage you to engage. And lastly, we have set aside time for audience questions after the panel. And if you have any questions for the panelists, please press the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. It's a little button, and you can submit a question. And if you are someone else who doesn't have a question, but you're scrolling through the questions, you can also upvote a question and comment on a question, and we will try to get to them at the end of the event. So many of you might be familiar with Progress Toronto, and Progress Toronto's mandate is to fight for a more democratic, socially just, and progressive city. Our theory of change is that we can win through people power. Our path to winning is not through lobbying politicians or massive corporate ad buys, but instead we really focus on making it easy for people to take action, and so we can build power. So we invest in trainings to build local power, we run advocacy campaigns, and put pressure with thousands of others on local politicians, and hold politicians accountable, and focus on taking power, which means that we work very closely on municipal elections to elect amazing candidates and to unelect terrible ones. And we did launch in 2018, and we will launch in 2018 to respond to a deep inequality in our city. And we all know that the crises that we faced here in Toronto existed much longer than before the pandemic. And so the COVID-19 pandemic has deepened these inequities and exposed them as public health risks, and has shown that their burden is felt most acutely by people experiencing poverty, women and Black, Indigenous, racialized, newcomer, and LGBTQ2S+ communities, and people with disabilities and seniors, and especially those who hold intersecting positions. As Mayor Tory and Toronto City Councillors plan for reopening of our city and invest in rebuilding, we cannot allow them to return to what was normal, because normal was not working for a lot of people in this city. And we need to demand more and use this historic opportunity to build back better. And that's why we work with dozens of other organizations to submit a list of 10 principles to City Council for bold, green, and just recovery for Toronto. I won't list them all tonight, but you can go and check them out on our website. But they do include a deep consultation with the public broadly and impacted communities, and expanding the use of race-based data in decision-making, using stimulus money to create equitable local jobs, stopping the surveillance and policing of communities, continuing to take over rental buildings and hotels, and move people into permanent housing, and much more. And that's also why we launched this Future of Our Cities series. Tonight is our third talk, and we want to really shift the conversation away from returning to normal and over to building back better. And we want to explore what is possible if we actually build our city when we center people and their experiences. And that's why tonight's conversation is so important. Our models of building a healthy, safe, and equitable city have failed. Police aren't keeping communities safe. Systemic anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism and police brutality is taking place across Canada and here in Toronto. Black people are 20 times more likely to die at the hands of police than white people here in Toronto. And the city, and our city right here, is funding the police to fail communities. The police budget is one of the biggest expenses in the city, and it is a whopping $1.08 billion this year, and it's increased more than $80 million over the last 2 years. Meanwhile, childcare, community recreation, overdose prevention, libraries, transit, housing and shelters, and so many more services are starved of resources and are underfunded in our city. And so we come to ask, how can we work to defund the police? And how can we invest in communities and programs that actually keep our communities safe? And so for this reason and so many others, we're so excited to hear from our panel tonight. And we are very excited at Progress Toronto that we partnered with the Urban Alliance on Race Relations for tonight's panel. And when you signed up, you had the opportunity to donate to their Black Youth Fellowship Program, and over 1,600 people donated. And together, we've raised over $36,000 for the program. I'm going to introduce Jared Walker, the chair of the Black Youth Fellowship and a board member of the Urban Alliance on Race Relations. And he will say a few words about their work.
All right, thank you so much. Thanks for everyone for being here tonight to have this critical discussion. I think the amount of y'all on this call speaks to the incredible power of the moment that we have before us. And I'm very thankful to be able to have the opportunity to share a bit about the Urban Alliance on Race Relations and our Black Youth Fellowship. I also want to give a shout out to Mohammed Hashim, whose visionary leadership, and he'll hate that I call it this, but his visionary leadership helped create the Muslim Youth Fellowship and make the Black Youth Fellowship a reality. And we're going to have a few other fellowships, a Tamil and a Filipino fellowship as well. The Urban Alliance on Race Relations is a nonprofit. We work across sectors with community, the private sector, the nonprofit and charitable space, and with public actors. We provide programs, research, and more generally, we provide expertise in bridge building to address systemic racism in our society and to root it out. Our Black Youth Fellowship, which I have the honor of chairing, is a nonpartisan program that in 2021 will provide 10 to 15 brilliant, driven Black youth with training, mentorship supports, and an opportunity to work in a city councilor's office. The goal is to put these young people on a fast track to success in the field of their choice while building sorely needed bridges between community and government. But like tonight's discussion, this program is also about power. Who has it, who doesn't, and how we can make sure that our institutions and systems reflect Black people and our experiences instead of, frankly, undermining us and contributing to our destruction. So if we get this right, we can create a platform that empowers the next generation of Black public servants, not just here in Toronto, but in city halls and legislatures and public institutions across the country. If you want to help, you can go to youthfellowship.ca/donate to give. You can read my op-ed in the Star and share it, and you can spread the word as far as you can throughout your networks. The more money we are able to raise out of date, the more we will be able to not just kick the fellowship off successfully, but also secure the future of this program and put in the work to get it expanded nationwide. So thanks again to Progress Toronto for convening this discussion and for supporting our fellowship and its work. And thanks to all y'all for coming out tonight and for giving to the fellowship. I'm really excited to hear from the folks that you actually came here to see. Thanks.
Thank you, Jared. And if you haven't had a chance to donate, we will be you can check out the UARR Toronto. I think a lot of people are posting in the chat, and there will be other opportunities to donate to that great cause. And now I would love to introduce Audrey Huntley. Audrey is the co-founder of No More Silence. No More Silence works to honor missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and Two-Spirit people. In her day job, Audrey is a victim rights paralegal at the Aboriginal Legal Services. Take it away, Audrey. I'm going to just unmute you.
Miigwech, thank you so much. Ani Bozo, everyone. I'm really honored to be saying a few words before this fantastic panel, and I'm really excited that there's so much interest. I'm sure that many of the people on the call today are feeling a lot of rage and grief, a lot of heartbreak over the losses that we've experienced in the last weeks, but also maybe some hope as we see this incredible surge in resistance and in interest in, fundamentally changing the status quo, which is what I hope that we are going to be talking about tonight. As mentioned, I'm the co-founder of No More Silence. If you're from Toronto, you may have heard of us because we've been around almost 20 years. I've been working under the leadership of Elder Wanda Whitebird, longtime prison justice activist and organizer here in the community. We work to support families, well, initially to break the silence around the missing and murdered, which is no longer, the secret that it once was. One of the things that we're known to do is show up at police headquarters every year in February, February 14th. That's the day that across Turtle Island, while across the country called Canada, people have been marching to honor their loved ones. Started in Vancouver's downtown east side over 20 years ago. We started in Toronto 15 years ago, and we go there to hold ceremony, to support the families, to honor the missing and murdered. We pick police headquarters because in our view, whenever we've talked about ending the violence, what we're doing is working for decolonization. So we see the roots of the violence as being systemic and rooted in the settler colonial project, so rooted in ongoing genocide, because we do see this as ongoing. And we're at police headquarters because the police, as you probably know, the RCMP were founded to remove Indigenous people from the land. They were the agents of settlement, and they continue to fulfill this role as do all local and provincial policing institutions. So basically, we're going there to call attention to that, not so much to call on the police to stop what they're doing. We actually think that they're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing, because that is what they're designed to do. We rarely address them, but when we do, it is to put them on notice and to let them know that their days are numbered, because we truly believe that abolition is going to happen, and it will happen in our lifetime. So for us, reforms aren't the answer. We're heartened to see, some city councilors put forward some calls for cuts, but we don't think that those are the solutions. When we hear defund, or when we say defund, we actually mean defund, like take away all the money. We mean defund, disarm, dismantle, abolish. And of course, that is going to have to go hand in hand with an end to settler colonialism, so decolonization, an end to racial capitalism. We've been doing, this work for a really long time, so we know that these are not, that these solutions aren't going to come to us overnight, but we do see the fundamental solutions being land back and a transformation of the governance systems that we currently are operating under. So return to Indigenous governance and right relations. There are models for this. There have been people thinking, not just Indigenous people, but Black people, leaders like Angela Davis thinking about abolition for decades. And there are many models for how we can govern ourselves along traditional models. The dish with one spoon is a covenant that is to this, a covenant between the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, the traditional people of this territory that have the dish with one spoon covenant, which ensured that everyone shared resources and that there was no harm done between these nations. So it was a spoon and not a knife, So I think that we can come up with those kind of solutions. Some things that can happen right away are community-led responses to crisis. I've been working, just as an example, over the last week, supporting community members, trying to assist Two-Spirit trans youth who's suicidal as a result of interactions with the police. And obviously, we're not going to call 911. We need safe houses. We need to fund our elders, our community healers, our medicine people, people who can actually help people overcome the trauma that is living in Canada today, that is being, survivor of genocide, that does not end in death, that does not end, that does not, end with someone going over a balcony or being shot 7 times. There are things that we can do right away that would address that. So that's just one. I'm excited to hear from the panel. Before I end, I just would like to say a few of the names that the Toronto police have killed or that have died as a result of their interactions with the police. And I would, ask the folks who are listening that have all joined us to remember these people and why we're here having this discussion. Lester Donaldson, Junior Manon, Michael Wade, Dondre Campbell, Sami Yatim, Brian Asenayu, Ian Price, and Regis Korchinski-Paquette. It's not a complete list. So those are my thoughts. We need to disarm, dismantle, and abolish. Miigwech.
Thank you, Audrey, for your words. So I'm going to now introduce our panelists in alphabetical order, and then our moderator, Angelyn, and then hand it over to Angelyn. Their full bios are on our website, so this is by no means a complete account of their many accomplishments. So Sandy Hudson is a co-founder of Black Lives Matter Toronto and an award-winning public intellectual who has received a lot of recognition for her work, including being honored as one of Toronto Life's 50 most influential Torontonians. She helped to found the Black Legal Action Center and is well known for her top-ranking podcast, Sandy and Nora Talk Politics, and which I personally am a huge fan of, so I urge everyone to check it out. And her new edited book, Until We Are Free, Reflections on Black Lives Matter in Canada, can be found at your local bookstore. Second is Phillip Dwight Morgan. Phillip is a first-generation Canadian writer whose writings have appeared in Maclean's, The Toronto Star, CBC News, HuffPost Canada, and Rabble.ca, among many others. He is also a member of Education Not Incarceration, and a group that is committed to ending the school-to-prison pipeline. In 2017, Education Not Incarceration played a critical role in the successful campaign to remove police from Toronto District School Board schools. Dr. Pam Palmater is a Mi'kmaq lawyer, professor, author, and social justice activist. She is the chair in Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University and is a well-known media commentator. She's considered one of Canada's top 5 most influential lawyers in human rights, and Pam was one of the spokespeople for the Idle No More movement. And she's frequently called as a legal expert before parliamentary and United Nations committees. Pam's current research focuses on police racism, abuse, and sexualized violence against Indigenous women and girls. Cheryl Prescod is the executive director at the Black Creek Community Health Center, and it's located in one of Toronto's most marginalized neighborhoods. She is a dedicated community leader for over 25 years and is known as a coalition builder, and she facilitates numerous community-university partnerships in research to build evidence that informs innovative approaches to complex problems such as youth violence. And last but not least, Angelyn Francis is our moderator tonight. Angelyn is a digital producer at the Star, and next month she will be moving to report on equity and inequality at the Star. So congratulations to Angelyn. She is also a writer, photographer, video producer, and host. Angelyn covers race, inequality, culture, food, and community initiatives, and sometimes she does it all at once. She previously hosted the season of Huffington Post's award-winning podcast, Born and Raised. Thank you to all of our fantastic panelists for joining us here tonight, and thanks to all of our attendees for joining. And over to you. And also thank you to Angelyn for agreeing to moderate. Over to you, Angelyn.
Hi, thank you all for joining us. I'm excited for the ideas that are going to come out of today's conversation. I know all of you to be really fantastic at your jobs and at your research, and I know you just have so much knowledge to share. I think it goes without saying that this conversation is not necessarily a new one. It has been proposed by Black and Indigenous communities for decades, but we're at such a big flashpoint at this point where it's entering headlines across the country, in the States, and of course in Canada as well, and around the world, really, obviously in light of recent events and deaths at the hands of police. And now what we're hoping to do is just move the conversation forward and address things from all different angles of it for people who don't necessarily know what defunding the police means, who need to learn a little bit more about how systemic racism plays out in the role of police, and then what we're going to do, what we can do to move forward as we take steps towards refocusing the funding that we put towards these kinds of racist systems. So I think to start off, I'm going to throw the first question to Sandy, because obviously we know that this problem tends to get framed a lot in the sense that it's a U.S. problem, it's south of the border, and it doesn't quite exist here, which we obviously know to not be true in light of numerous events and cases. So Sandy, can you provide some insight into how systemic anti-Black racism persists in policing in Canada and in Toronto?
Sure, and thank you to Progress Toronto for having me, and I feel really honored to be a part of this panel. Coming to you from Tongva territory in the southern western part of Turtle Island, very far away. I'm stuck here because of COVID, and here we are. Yes, this is not simply an American problem, and I think the way that anti-Black racism often operates in Canada is through denial. And when I say that, I mean that very often, we've even seen today in the House of Commons, Jagmeet Singh trying to move a motion about racism in the RCMP, anti-Blackness and anti-Indigeneity, and a Bloc Québécois MP stopping the motion, blocking the motion from getting heard. Jagmeet Singh saying like this is racism right here, and then being kicked out of the House, and all of the headlines not talking to Teddy, the MP who blocked the motion, and asking him to justify why he was blocking such a motion given everything that has been going on in the last couple of weeks, but instead demanding from Jagmeet Singh, are you sorry? Will you apologize? Do you truly think that this man is racist? I mean, that's just exactly how Canada's brand of anti-Black racism operates. More specifically, the police really do target our communities in a number of ways. The Special Resource Officer program that exists in schools, currently in the Toronto Catholic District School Board, certainly still in Toronto, though a coalition of activists were able to, through a lot of hard work, Phillip, I know you know, a lot of hard work, able to get that out of the Toronto District School Board. But I mean, people should know, and might be surprised to know, that those programs are not universal. Where the police are operating in schools, if you put it over a map of where the most Black students are, the most racialized students are, they match up. They're not in every school. They're just in the schools that target our folks. Carding. I mean, I know you've all heard stories about how carding is over. It's not. And I'll tell you that the police aren't going to Post Road and the bridle path to engage in patrolling and stopping people on the street and asking them for their identification. And then in some cases, like what happened to Jermaine Carby up in Peel region, killing them. Okay, they're doing that in Black communities, they're doing that in poor communities, they're doing that in Indigenous communities, and that's another way that they target our communities. There's also programs like TAVIS, this type of community policing programs where, again, they're patrolling our communities. They are a constant fixture in our neighborhoods, and they are not providing safety and security services to us. They're terrorizing us. And, you know, there's so many names, so many examples of people who have been killed by the police. As was said in the introduction, in Toronto, Black people are 20 times more likely to be killed. And this is an issue that our politicians, people who are decision makers, have ignored for years, for decades. And it's time for that to end. We can't just look to the United States and only report on issues that are happening in the United States and only say we want to talk about George Floyd, but we don't want to talk about Regis Korchinski-Paquette. We don't want to talk about Cheryl Moore, Chantel Moore, and we don't want to talk about DeAndre Campbell and all of the many, many other people who have been brutalized and killed by the police.
Very well said. And we're going to come back to a few of those points too, like with the school resource officers as we talk further along. But I think I'll throw it to Dr. Palmater next, Pam. You've definitely done extensive research and you have spoken extensively about anti-Black and anti-Indigenous practices and racism in police. Specifically, you did a video called Yes, RCMP, You Are Racist on YouTube. And you gave a bit of a primer on police racism here in Canada there. I was wondering if you could share a little bit of that with us now and anything else you'd like us to know about the Indigenous context of this problem.
Great. Thank you so much for having me to be a part of this. Like, it's a huge honor to be amongst all these panelists. And for everybody that is tuned in, I think the most important thing you need to know is think critically about things you hear in the media, because we are here to show that Black Lives Matter and Indigenous peoples are working in solidarity. We are together, and no amount of journalism or naysayers are going to cause divisions within us. We are united because we know what it's like. We have been dealing with this for decades. And I'm glad you raised my YouTube video, because what I'm trying to do is really hit home accessible information. No one's probably going to watch a lecture, me doing a lecture for an hour, but if I kind of hit the highlights on what the worst stereotypes in media headlines are and debunk them, I think that propels us to the next level where we can talk about defunding the police. But when we're stuck at, hey, Canada, do you think there's racism? I mean, you're literally on a wheel of going nowhere. So I did a video on Yes, RCMP, You Are Racist, because the commissioner was saying there was no systemic racism. And then I did one for the media about, yes, media, Canada is racist. And basically 5 key points that came out of that. One, that racism is a fact. It's not us having a debate or a theory. It's not political rhetoric. I mean, we've had numerous justice inquiries, commissions, reports, coroner's reports, it all concludes police are killing us because of racism. And the statistics, you can't lie about the statistics. Number 2, racism is against the law. So we're not talking about us being politically correct or feeling an offense to what someone is saying to us. I wish it was just name calling. I literally wish it was just all of the dirty looks, but it's not. We're talking about breaking anti-discrimination, anti-racism, human rights laws, and genocide, which is the worst crime that any state can commit in the entire world. So we're talking about big time laws that are being broken here. Number 3, the bad apples. Oh my goodness. They want to believe that, oh, it's just a few bad guys. Well, first of all, is policing with heavily armed men something that you want to be only a few bad guys? No, that's like saying it's okay if there's a few pilots that are bad guys or a few surgeons. It's a zero tolerance when you're talking about human life. And the other thing is, oh my goodness, the stats totally prove that this is widespread. I mean, they would like to say, well, there's a few bad guys in every bunch. Well, when your whole bunch is spoiled, then what's your defense? Number 4 is this blue wall of silence being portrayed as camaraderie Or, you know, these guys have really hard jobs, you know, it's really hard for them. They need to stick together. And, you know, there's a lot of people who have hard jobs. Fire fighters have hard jobs. Emergency room surgeons have hard jobs. You know, therapists have hard jobs, but none of them have a license to kill us, be judge, jury, and executioner for anything. And there is no crime in Canada that has a death penalty. So none of the killings of Black and Indigenous peoples are justified. And then finally, number 5 is, you know, stop making excuses. Stop saying they didn't know better, or maybe they just need training, or, you know, maybe, you know, it is a hard job. Do you want to be a police officer? Who do you want to call when something happens? Well, good grief. What happens when we do call them? That's how we're getting killed. That's how we're getting sexually abused. That's how we're getting over incarcerated, over arrested. That's how domestic abuse victims are violated by the police. It's by calling the police. And so I think when you make excuses, it's complicity in violence. And that is a part of it. So you're being part of it. You're taking an active part in it when you excuse it. And I just think, you know, it's long past time that we get past this, you know, oh, the poor cops. There's only a few bad ones. It's not. I have yet to meet, and I've done extensive research, any police officer on any force in Canada who A, either admitted to wrongdoing themselves, or B, said, I didn't do it, but all my buddies do it. So they're all very well aware of the problem. They just don't deal with it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Palmater. Yeah, all very true. And now, Cheryl, you've worked on the ground in Toronto and locally in community, particularly in one of the more heavily policed communities in Toronto for over 25 years. So do you have anything to add about the local impacts of policing or any stories that you've witnessed over the years?
So I wouldn't say I worked on the ground anymore. I'm in the office most of the time. So shout out to our community workers who are actually at the front line dealing with the impact of bad policing and the racism that happens in our communities. Everything that's been said, Sandy mentioned the carding, the policing in schools, the overly surveilled communities happens in the area that we work, and the impact on especially young people is just that lack of trust in law enforcement to the point where they will not even call on the police. You know, a parent will not call on the police for help, unfortunately, because they don't feel like they're being served and protected. In fact, what happens, unfortunately, is they risk their child or themselves getting killed, which is the unfortunate truth. And this leads to, I mean, as a community health center, our business is healthcare. And we see the deteriorating health of our community when young people especially are having to deal with PTSD. Yes, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, with the constant violence they see, not only within, you know, because of the, you know, the social determinants of health, lack of housing, lack of care, lack of access to so many things, to jobs, but the fact that they are being so surveilled. Police are in their schools. You know, children should not be learning with police in their schools. They should not be seeing the heavy presence of arms in their community. You know, we talk about other countries with, you know, arms in the streets, and this should not happen with our community here in Canada. So I think, again, when I think of the impact, it really is the destructiveness that's happening within our young people in particular. Police have, you know, after a shooting, well-broadcasted shooting in one of our schools, police went into the schools, but we have no evidence that anything happened, that anything got better. What happened instead is that young people were surveilled even closer, and they're now, most of them, incarcerated because their names are being given to police by other systems.
Thank you. Yeah, it sets it up for so many health issues down the line, stress, and just a lack of trust in a lot of different systems, apart from even just policing that exists in society. So thank you so much for that. And Phillip, do you have anything that you want to add to that in terms of like what kind of systemic racism plays out in policing in Canada?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with everything that everybody said. The points were just brilliant, and I'm very honored to be on this panel. I'm glad that Sandy brought up the example of Jagmeet Singh, because I think it perfectly illustrates the way that media is complicit in perpetuating anti-Black racism. You know, I think about some of the protests that happened recently, and rather than actually talking about what was the core and substance of the protest, so ensuring that, you know, Black folks, Indigenous folks aren't brutalized and killed by police, the protest itself became a sort of object of attention for media. And so it was about, you know, here are the streets to avoid because there's going to be heavy traffic, or look at these businesses that are putting up boards because they're afraid of looting, et cetera, et cetera. All of it was sort of done to distract from the central issue of, again, protecting Black lives. And, you know, my most recent piece for The Star, I talk about how, you know, Saunders knelt in front of the crowd and, you know, announced that there was going to be body cameras coming to the city. Well, Black and brown people are asking that, are saying that we don't want to be killed or brutalized. We're not asking for body cameras. We're not asking to be filmed as we're killed and brutalized. We want it to stop. And so the way for that to happen is to defund the police. The final thing that I'll say is that I think most people aren't aware of just how far-reaching the impacts of policing are in the city. Using police in schools as an example, you know, there are documented cases of police asking students about their immigration status, for example, and then finding out that they're undocumented and taking that information and reporting it to Canadian Border Services and threatening that child and their family with risk of deportation. So that's just one small example of the way that these various systems of law enforcement violence are sort of interconnected and actually cover a wide range of impacts within the city.
Yeah, it's that last point. It just makes you so much more vulnerable. If you're more heavily policed, you end up having more interaction with these kinds of systems. Earlier when Cheryl was also talking, I was thinking of the issues that kind of are presented when kids could then be taken from their families if for some reason they're found to be in an unsafe environment, quote unquote. And that has been an issue that's affected Indigenous communities across the country as well too for years. And talking a little bit more about defunding, you already kind of started off, Phillip, talking about the body cams and the kinds of solutions that are proposed that are meant to kind of get at reform and trying to heal the system from within or whatever have you. But Pam, you've done a lot of research on human rights and law enforcement, and you've been very critical of all of the attempts at these kinds of oversight and accountability, particularly as it applies to Indigenous people and women and girls. Can you tell us a little bit more about how they're inadequate and how many of the reforms brought have been pretty ineffective thus far?
You know, this is my pet peeve, so I'm going to watch the time so I don't rant forever about that, because honestly, you can ask any student who's ever been in my class or anyone who's ever heard me talk about this. I am so sick and tired of people saying, the cops just don't know better. It's an unconscious bias when they say, hey, you effing Indian, I'm going to effing kill you. That's unconscious. I mean, it's so beyond the realm of reality. So when reports and inquiries, and I believe that these commissions are all very well intended, the vast majority of the recommendations tend to stay in a safe zone, you know, as if they're trying to mediate the status quo. And for me, when you dance around the edges of the status quo, you preserve it. You know, so making little tiny changes or amendments on the outside, all it's doing is preserving the status quo. And by preserving the status quo, you preserve the really blatant and violent racism against Black and Indigenous peoples that never gets addressed. So one of the most common recommendations in all of these, you know, investigations are to have cultural awareness training for Indigenous peoples. I mean, I'm talking about cops who rape Native women, who brutalize Native men, and who kill Black people. There is nothing they can go and learn about powwows or ceremonies or what it means to be a Haida or Mi'kmaq person, because the problem is in our culture. It's not about what it means to be a Black person or what it means to be a Mi'kmaq person. That is the problem. It's them thinking that they can act outside of the law because we're Black and Indigenous and that our lives are worthless and that they can kill us and be judge, jury, and executioner. That's the problem. So when they have cultural awareness training, or they have what they call sensitivity training, so that they're more sensitive to gender issues or more sensitive to what they call diversity, it's all along the same thing. And first of all, they resist it, and those that do it, it's shown to have zero impact on how police continue their violence against us. And that's the same with this unconscious bias training. You're literally training the police to believe that if someday they're ever accused of being racist, it's not their fault. It's totally unconscious. When we know the videos show that it's so not unconscious. And I guess the other thing around, so, all of this cultural diversity training doesn't work. Also, diversity and inclusion on police forces doesn't work. It's well intended. I see why people think it will work. But look at all of the police forces in the US and Canada that were violating all of the human rights of the protesters, that were being violent. There was a wide variety of diversity amongst those police officers. So it's police culture that's the problem. It's the fact that you've got racist, violent, and sexist, primarily men, recruiting the same kinds of men, retaining the same kinds of men, and promoting the same kinds of men, that perpetuates this problem. And so it's only going to be a radical set of recommendations, a radical path forward that gets at the root of the problem that's going to deal with this. And the vast majority, I would say 95% of all the recommendations I have ever read are in the realm of, let's do it safe, what a politician or police force might accept, something that they can have a plan and work on for a while and nothing changes, but they can tick a whole bunch of boxes and say, look, we did 80 out of 90 recommendations. So, we're well on our way, but nothing changes. And the evidence is in Black and Indigenous peoples here tonight saying we need to defund the police because everything else isn't working.
And it's funny because it's almost like those same ideas get recycled year after year, decade after decade, time after time, as though they're new. Even today, there's going to be someone in the Q&A flagged it, and we also reported on it earlier in the Star, but the Toronto police are going to be discussing a motion about anti-racism training and expanding their mental health teams and that's just having a conversation about it at the board meeting on Friday to see if they'll even put it into place. So it's just kind of the same talks again and again. And Phil, you've talked a lot as well about the inadequate reforms that Toronto Police specifically has been trying to implement. So is there anything else that you want to add from the Toronto perspective? Phillip, I was just wondering, you mentioned a little bit in the last time you spoke about body cams, but I was wondering if there are any other reforms that Toronto Police has tried to implement that you want to bring up right now.
Well, I mean, for starters, it's so hard to be muted because as Pam was talking, I just wanted to be screaming, be like, yes, keep going. So it was, I think specifically in terms of Toronto, I would urge all the people that are in attendance to just Google OHRC, so Ontario Human Rights Commission, police timeline, and just look through their documented timeline of police killings and also attempts at police reform. And the timeline that they have goes from 1978 into 2017, and look where we are, right? And so, this is part of a larger issue that I see with policing, which is that it's often decontextualized. The police show up and they say, hey, we can do better. Just give us a chance. And they don't acknowledge that there's a long history of harming people, of killing people, of devastating communities, right? And so, you know, anti-racist, anti-oppression training, you know, body cameras, none of these things change that history. And so when they show up and they're trying to do the work of de-escalating a situation when someone's in crisis, they bring that history to that situation. That person in crisis sees people with guns and flak jackets and all the rest of it, and knows that there's a history of that person and their institution killing other people in their community, and they're expected to somehow calm down. It doesn't make any sense at all. It's completely ludicrous. The police budget, as folks have noted, has gone up so much over the last decade, but really in the last few years. And look at the types of things it's been spent on. It's been spent on militarizing the police, giving them like bigger and better weapons. It's been spent on increasing the surveillance in the city. Toronto is a city that I think is hostile to racialized folk, and the police are responsible for penalizing them. And so, you know, we have cuts to shelters, we have cuts to TTC, we have cuts to all these different services. And rather than actually putting money into those services and making sure that they're robust, the city has chosen to invest in police and crack down on people, and to make sure that that's how we deal with issues of inequality in the city. And it's ridiculous, and it's got to change.
And that's a perfect segue to move a little bit more to talking about why exactly it is that everybody has been calling for defunding the police, and why that is going to be the best path forward. So Sandy, can you speak a little bit to that and what it would mean to defund the police in Toronto, and why it would be the best solution to these issues?
Definitely. But first, I need to hail up what some of my co-panelists have been saying, because it's just so important. You know, Professor Palmater talks about how this isn't implicit bias, like they know what they're doing. They absolutely do. And in fact, because I'm a law student now and I'm reading all of these reports, I can share with you some research that I read just the other day. One that's in the Yale Law Review and one that's in the Tulane Law Review, that suggests that when police have body cameras, it either has zero impact on their likelihood to use lethal force, or they're more likely to use lethal force. And part of the reason that they're more likely to use lethal force when they have body cameras is because they believe that what they're doing is right. They are conscious about what they're doing, and they are taking that choice. And they're like, people are going to see it, and they believe that what they're doing is right. And so there are all sorts of reasons why we shouldn't have body cameras. It's more money to the police. It doesn't help us, but also it could be putting us in more danger. And also a part of the reason why I think what Phillip was just saying with respect to, there's this long timeline of reports, and we act as though it's new every single time. Part of the failure there is in the media. You know, if you're reporting every single time that somebody who is Black or Indigenous is killed by police, like, is this a racism problem? Or this is an isolated incident, or something like that, instead of tying it back to every single issue that's already happened, you are being complicit in the violence. You are allowing the violence to happen. The police know that they can get away with this stuff because they've been getting away with it for decades. They've been getting away with it for decades, and it is absolutely unconscionable that they're continuing to report on things this way. That is unacceptable. Okay, the budget. The budget right now, 25%, more than 25% of the Toronto taxpayer dollars are going to police services. And I know most people cite the number 1.08 billion, but I actually think it is more, it's better to cite another number, which is 1,127,000,000, because that includes police services, the police board, and the police parking authority. So let's just put it all in there. Let's just put it all together. That is how much money that is, $1,127,000,000, okay, in taxpayer funds. The amount that goes to the TTC is less than 790 million in taxpayer dollars. 100 million compared to less than $800 million going to the TTC. Public health, as Cheryl was talking about earlier, you know, the way that we focus on public health in our city is abysmal. It is less than 2% of the city's budget of the taxpayer dollars are going to public health. And that amounts to $69 million. And I'm like looking at all these numbers right now because we're doing a project at BLM Toronto. We're like getting all of these numbers in from a researcher who's looking at it across the GTHA and beyond. And like the numbers are astounding. In Peel region, it's 40%, I know this just focuses on Toronto, but I think people should know this, that 40% of taxpayer dollars are going to the police. What can we fund? What can we build? What can we support if we don't have all of that money going into the police and going into terrible services? I mean, beyond the fact that they are killing us, even what they claim to do, and I'm sure we'll get into this more in the panel tonight, what they claim to do well, they don't do well. So, you know, we have to ask ourselves, like, what are we doing? Why are we prioritizing this as one of our top priorities in the city when they are killing us and they are not making us safer and they're not making us more secure? I think that if we were to fund social housing, we'd be more secure. If we were to fund public health, we'd be more safe and secure. It is ridiculous to farm that responsibility out to these people who are trained over 24 weeks and have absolutely no ability to provide safety and security for us in that way.
Thank you, Sandy. And Cheryl, I wanted to ask you, what, when you hear defunding the police and reinvesting in communities, what do you envision yourself?
Well, I think I can't answer that question without reinforcing the structural racism that permeates all of our institutions. The policing impacts our children who are taken into child welfare systems. It impacts our healthcare system when our healthcare institutions call the police at the first sight of an angry Black man. So it's an intersectional issue that will not be solved only by investing more funds. Certainly we need more funding. Definitely the numbers that Sandy quoted, thank you, I admit I was going to do that, because we're talking the investments in communities. It's just such a fraction of what policing is in the investments in policing. And the impact and the numbers keep going up every year. In all other, in business, you have to prove yourselves. You have to prove your successes before you're given more funding. We see no evidence, little evidence, because there's very little data to show that policing, increasing policing in communities really is making a difference in improving the safety and security of individuals, but they continue to have more and more funding. So whereas in the healthcare system, in the public health system, we are constantly fighting for more small amounts of dollars, and we have to demonstrate those outcomes and those impacts in a short period of time to undo the harm of much of what we've been talking about tonight, that structural racism, that normalization, that one group of people is better than another group of people. We've normalized it in all of our systems, and until we get away from that, the investments we make will not make much of a difference. So certainly, reallocating funds to community, to health and well-being of our individuals will be great. We can't have this conversation today also without talking about COVID and the detrimental impacts it's having on the Black and Indigenous communities and those most vulnerable. And I'm concerned about what will happen post, as we move out of COVID, hopefully soon. We will have even more policing and more surveillance in our communities because this disease has impacted disproportionately the Black community. It's disproportionately impacted women. So gender-based violence has gone up. We know that. Mental health issues have gone up. And if we continue to call the police to address those issues, we will be in a much worse state than we can even imagine. So again, this is the time. If not, if we don't know that this is the time that we need to do something drastic to invest in our communities in different ways. Police are not social workers. Police are not, especially armed police. They're not there to help our women who are being destroyed by violence, by, in the home, domestic violence, by being trafficked. There are so many social issues that are going unaddressed because there's not enough investment. So please, I implore everyone listening tonight to really think about those communities and think about that equity, really, of investments that needs to happen, because we're all impacted. This is not a Black problem, an Indigenous problem. This is a Canadian problem that we've got to do something about. And that structural racism that exists, that was demonstrated today against Jasmeet Singh, I mean, it's there, and and it's in our faces.
Thank you so much for that. I'm tempted to underscore everything you just said, but you said it so beautifully. So, especially your point about the about businesses having to prove the benefits before they're rewarded with more money. I recently was reading the Toronto budget, and whenever they're requesting more money, it's usually because crime didn't go down the year prior. So it's almost like the reason we need more is because nothing happened prior. But anyway, I want to move on a little bit more because a lot of the people watching are kind of looking for a little bit more, a few more arguments and a few more tools and roadmaps to use in conversations that they're having with people about on this topic who may have a different opinion and may not be very in favor of defunding the police. So I think maybe we could start with Sandy. What would your 1 minute pitch to somebody? If you had 1 minute to speak to somebody, what common arguments do you tend to hear, and what would you respond to them if you just had their ear for like 30 seconds or a minute?
Well, I think I would say, look, I know that when some people hear defund the police because of years of indoctrination and propaganda, they hear take away my safety and security. And that's not at all what we're saying. And in fact, what we're saying is that for Black communities and for Indigenous communities, the police do not provide safety and security whatsoever, and they barely provide it to anybody else. And aren't Black people and Indigenous people worth it? Aren't our lives worth considering a completely new way of approaching this issue? And finally, I would also point out that the origin of policing here is to control and restrict Black and Indigenous people's movement through genocide, removing Indigenous people from their land, killing them, and through kidnapping Black people who had liberated themselves. That's an irredeemable institution. There is obviously reverberations today where they continue to try to control and restrict our movement and kill us. That is an irredeemable institution over centuries. It has shown itself to be unchangeable and irredeemable. Why are you invested in this? Why couldn't we provide safety and security in a way that doesn't target and kill us?
And Dr. Palmater, I wonder if you could give me the same answer. What would you say in 1 minute to somebody? But I may also add to that too, because you also specifically talk a lot about violence against women and girls. I've heard people say or tweet that sexual assaults will go up if there's no police and different things like that. So that's one myth or something to debunk perhaps in a conversation.
Okay, so my 1 minute pitch. All right, you don't want to defund the police? Let's defund racism in the police. And here's what you'll save. You'll save hundreds of millions in surveillance of just Black and Indigenous communities, and actually maybe surveil international terrorism, for example. You will save all of the money that we pay as a public on civil class actions against all of the police forces, on all of the multi-hundred million, now over in the billions of class actions just against the RCMP. You will save hundreds of millions in the militarization of police forces, because remember, we kind of already have a military in Canada. You don't need multiple ones. You will save all of the money of all of these cops who are suspended with pay and all of their legal fees that are paid for, literally can be paid for decades. You will save on all of the cops who shouldn't be in schools, hospitals, unions, or at events, protests, picnics, or powwows. All you will have left is a little tiny group of people who could focus all their efforts on protecting us and doing investigations and making sure that we're safe. That's if you just defund racism.
And Phillip, what would your 1 minute pitch to somebody be?
All right, so if I have 1 minute pitch, I'm going to say, hey mom, hey dad, person who doesn't believe in defunding the police, whatever. I was just in this incredible Progress Toronto webinar where I heard some brilliant Black and Indigenous thinkers calls for defunding the police. And as someone who walks around in a protest and holds up Black Lives Matter signs and things like that, I am choosing to listen to the calls of Black and Indigenous people and to listen to what they're saying, which is that they want to defund the police because they do not feel safe by police. And there is a long history of police killing and brutalizing Black and Indigenous people. And as someone who's an ally, I am choosing to listen to those folks. That is a simple, I boil it down as simple as it can be. If you were going to be in the streets, if you were saying that you are here for this, then you got to listen to the folks and what they're calling for in community. And I've been calling this for this for a very long time. It's time to listen.
Thank you, Phil. And Cheryl, do you have one for the audience?
I don't need a minute. I would just say, put yourself in my shoes when I'm terrified, when my son, my Black son, leaves the house, and I'm terrified that he will not come home because he died at the hands of a police officer simply because he has Black skin. I would say, put yourself in my shoes. That's all.
Simple as that. Actually, I'll throw it back to you again, Cheryl, because there's a couple other very specific kind of misconceptions, I guess, that we could work, a few misconceptions that we could debunk around why we need police. And one of them is gun violence in the city. A lot of people point to that as a reason to increase policing budgets. And what do you think? What do you think of this from a community and from a public health perspective, from your own experience here? What would be? How would you counter this argument for police helping, quote unquote, with gun violence?
Again, am I off? I would say that number one, there's no evidence that increased policing decreases gun violence in communities. We're seeing more and more gunplay actually in the hands of young people, teenagers now, especially in the community that I work. And my question is, where are they getting these guns from? And what are we doing? What is our system doing to dismantle those larger organizations that I'm sure are making millions from selling guns and bringing them into the hands of these children? So I feel that there needs to be something else, some other. And our children were not born with the intent to kill each other. There are tremendous ills within our communities that were caused by the systemic racism from the time that they entered the system, the education system that has taught them that they were not worthwhile. They are not part of this society, and they have targets on their backs. We have police that have been called on a 6-year-old in a school. You know, how can we really, support a system that does that to children? So I feel that the gun violence is simply a symptom of the wrongs that have been embedded within our system. And policing is not the answer. The investments need to be in early interventions, very, very early interventions, and dismantling that whole system that has taught these young people that their lives are dispensable, and they need to have a gun in their hands, and someone is convincing them to pick up that gun and shoot each other. And the police, again, as I say, we need data to demonstrate that the increased police presence, increased police budgets really is making a difference. Give us the data, show us that data. And I think the reason we don't have it, and it's not public and it's not transparent, is because the data is disturbing to the police.
Thank you so much. And now I think we can talk a little bit about how do we actually bring safety to communities, and how can we actually keep communities safe? So, Phil, if we were to actually keep communities safe, if the city were to defund the police, what would the alternatives be? And what other enforcement measures do we need to look at changing as well, like TTC, fair inspectors, and other systems like that?
For me, it's about removing barriers to access. Like, it's not, I don't even want to sort of entertain conversations about enforcement or punitive measures. I want to talk about how can we make this city as inhabitable and as accessible to as many people as possible. So we should be pouring funds into public health, education, transit, for example. I mean, I think it's ridiculous that special constables, police, particular stations and particular routes, and, arrest people and injure them for $3. It's ridiculous, right? And for what? Like, it's just, so I think we should be investing in the services that make the city work. And I don't really know what to say beyond that, to be honest. I just think that, as I said before, we know that Toronto is a city where the conditions around housing, for example, are terrible. Housing's unaffordable for so many people. The condition, there's lots of people in the city who have bed bugs, cockroaches, houses and apartments in states of disrepair, etc. We should be pouring money into making housing more affordable and improving the conditions. But instead, what we've done is we've used police to penalize people and to push them into even worse and even more precarious situations rather than actually investing in resources. The police are not a resource.
And Sandy, do you have anything to add to that about what greater investments in communities would look like, and what would it cost in comparison to what we're already spending on police?
Well, sure. I mean, one thing that I think a lot of people don't necessarily know is that the vast majority of calls that the police respond to have nothing to do with crime. They're non-criminal in nature. Numbers suggest that up to 80% of the calls that the police are responding to are for some sort of mental health crisis, or for an alarm that's gone off, maybe because a raccoon was in the area or something like that. Like, literally, they're not doing what we think that we're doing. It is not what you watch on television through the numerous police shows out there that suggest that they've got all this unlimited budget and interest in solving all of these problems. And so I think that a big piece of this is going to have to be decriminalization. I think that part of what Phillip is talking about, when he says, we're like going after people for $3, that is criminalizing poverty. I'll admit to you right now that I have snuck onto the TTC and not paid at times in my life when I could not afford it. Okay, like, that's just, and so what? We think that providing safety and security is arresting and incarcerating people who can't afford the way that we've constructed our society to be unaffordable. I think that that's absolutely ludicrous. If we were to put a bunch of the money that we put into, fair enforcement, into making the TTC affordable, maybe even free, guess what? We don't need to spend money on fair enforcement. If we put a bunch of the money that we put into targeting and policing people who engage in drug use. Instead, put that into public health, helping people if they need it, providing the services that they need. Guess what? We don't need to police people for that, because, you know, it's not keeping other people safe. Like, we're just trying to control a particular type of person in our society that is undervalued. And those people who are undervalued are poor, are Black, are Indigenous, and that is unacceptable. And so how much is it going to cost? Well, currently right now, the cost is far too much. The cost is far too much. Our deaths are far too much. So I don't actually care how much it costs. What I do know is that we won't need the policing and the enforcement, all the money that's attached to that, if we invest in safety and security for our society. And I just want to mention a couple other things that I think is really important for people to know who are listening. Like, when people hear that, oh, sexual assault is going to go up, like less than 10% of sexual assaults are reported to the police. They are not providing a service for sexual assault, and they are embroiled in all sorts of sexual assault cases themselves. Okay, people are like, what are we going to do when there's a burglary or some theft? One, very rarely are police stopping something when it happens, and two, when they're responding to when it does happen, your insurance company is far more useful to you than the police, who only clear, and clear means lay a charge, it doesn't mean solve. They only clear less than 16% of burglaries and thefts in this country. They do a terrible job at what they're doing. I don't know what other service we would look at these kinds of numbers and think, okay, let's just keep on funding them, more increase here. Let's just ignore all of the people who are dying and not being served by this service. It's like abysmal. And, the fact that we don't know this in society is, again, partially because of who is undervalued in society. I keep talking about the media. It just makes me so upset that we don't know these numbers already, that we don't know this information already. But there it is.
Thank you. And Dr. Palmater, do you have anything to add on what you'd like to see in terms of community reinvestment?
Well, I think it goes without saying that the most critical socioeconomic conditions in this country are in Indigenous communities. We have been in that way since contact. I mean, the whole creation of the Northwest Mounted Police was to remove us from the land, eliminate us, and keep us trapped on reserves. Our whole identity has been criminalized. So, poverty has been criminalized, and that's very widespread. But being an Indigenous person has been criminalized. If we didn't send our kids to residential schools, the RCMP would be called. If we tried to leave the reserve, the RCMP would be called. If we tried to hunt and fish or pick berries in our own territories, everyone would be called. The RCMP, Fisheries and Oceans, Natural Resources, local police officers. I mean, every major court case in this country has been us just defending our identity from criminality. And in fact, the only way we've survived genocide is to be criminally Indigenous. That means break all of these laws that are unjust and continue to exist as people. And what we're saying now is that they're not going to voluntarily decriminalize poverty or decriminalize indigeneity. So what we have to do is take the bold step of being criminally Black, criminally Indigenous, and criminally impoverished until we're not anymore. And that's where the power lies. The police and governments don't have power, they have guns. That's force, and that's different. But what we're doing here, what we're doing in our communities, are resisting and educating and rising up, that's real power. And that's what will force the change. And I think that's where it's going to come from. It's going to come from us exercising our sovereignty as Indigenous peoples, our power as Black communities, and forcing these changes. Because when we fight, we win every time, whether it's civil rights in the US, women's rights, Indigenous rights, you name it. When we fight, we win. So we just have to keep fighting.
Thank you so much. And Cheryl, I want to ask you, if the police in Toronto are defunded and there's now hundreds of millions of dollars that can provide community services, what would that look like, and what kinds of services and programs would you want to see funded instead?
So I'll start off by saying it's hard to follow that Pam's passion there. We have to rise up, because for me, working in the community and seeing things like baby food behind a cage, locked cage in a grocery store, seeing seniors having to shoplift because they don't have money to buy food is shameful. We have to figure out how to provide a living wage for people so that they can survive and thrive in our communities. Invest some of those dollars in those things, and it's been said already, provide transportation for folks, provide training so that, people in our communities can actually contribute. Black people, Indigenous people have contributed tremendously to building this country, and now they are being killed. So reparations need to happen. Reparations to bring them to a place where they should be. It should not be an argument. We should not have to fight for it. It should be something that's given. So give people a living wage. Figure out ways that people can be food secure, job secure, housing secure, and provide the right resources for people dealing with mental health issues. The examples of these are in Indigenous communities, where people are, if it's violence we're talking about, it's people are taking control of their communities, using their ways of doing and knowing, so that they've created a sense of safety for folks around them. And the communities know how to do that themselves. And many of them are building their capacity. They're using their ways, and it's not expensive. Other models of interrupting violence are in other jurisdictions, in other countries, in the US. We need to look at those models that are bringing together folks from the community, using the community as the experts and paying them a living wage so that they can solve and be part of the solution for the people around them, because communities care about each other. People in communities, they do not want to see their neighbors die. They do not want to see their neighbors' homes being invaded in the middle of the night by police looking for, a bit of drugs that their child might have. These are things that communities need to be involved in planning and supporting. So no answer to what the program is exactly, but there are strategies that need to be looked into that are out there already, but we need to start with engagement of community first.
And thank you so much, Cheryl, because it is so important to hear from communities about what it is they actually need and what they experience, as opposed to constantly being told that this is what we're going to be funding year after year. And thank you so much for sharing so many personal stories earlier and now too. And I think as we start to kind of wrap things up, something that a lot of people who have signed up for this will also want to know is how to specifically take action and how to continue to, again, spread this message to more people, and what next steps would look like tangibly, because there's a motion being brought to defund the police by 10% on City Council, and there have been so many different examples in the states of what things like this could look like, but what can people actually do to continue to take action? So I think I'll go to Phillip next, because you worked with education, not incarceration, with others to successfully get police out of schools in Toronto. So how did that process go, and what sorts of things were you up against, and how did it ultimately become successful?
So the first thing I need to do is to note that the SRO program was introduced in 2008, and right away there were community organizations that were fighting against it. So while people may be familiar with 2017 and the news coverage around that, it was almost a decade of struggle. And so I need to pay respects to all the folks that were doing that work. Back then, organizations like No Cops, Surge, JFAP, there are so many others and I'm going to miss them. But the whole point is, one, try and get involved with an organization. we need folks to get involved. And you may feel like, oh, I don't have the skills. I'm not particularly loud. I can't imagine marching in the street. We need people making signs. We need people folding pamphlets. We need, whatever your skill set is, there's going to be a use for you. So get involved. The other thing I want to say is that, so recently the chief of police, Mark Saunders, stepped down. From what I can see, in my humble opinion, this is laying the groundwork for the police to sort of pivot and talk about reform. Saunders was essentially the sacrificial lamb. The police say, we realize that there are problems, et cetera, and we've listened to you and we're going to change. You can even see that there's a motion in place at the Police Services Board meeting this Friday to talk about police reform. So, one, if you're able, you need to go to those police services meetings and hold them accountable and let them know that these reforms that they're talking about are not what you're interested in. You need to hold their feet to the flame and let them know that this is that we're not talking about body cameras, we're not talking about more training, we're talking about defunding the police. Now, bear in mind that space is not safe for everyone. So you really need to take into account the risk that's involved. With that being said, I just want to take a second to shout out the panelists here, because I know for a fact there's at least one other person on this panel that's been threatened by police before. I know I've been threatened by police before. So these kinds of talks come with tremendous risk, but we're doing it because we know that this is the only way forward. The final thing I'll say is, a number of people have pointed to what I would call the sort of perpetual and chronic dehumanization of Black and Indigenous folks, whether it's perpetuated by media, police, etc. You have a role to play in challenging that. I know every time one of my articles goes up, all the Twitter trolls come at me and they have all kinds of things to say. It's not my work to defend against those folks. I've already put my heart and soul into the piece to try and share information with people. But what you can do is you can intervene and you can comment and disrupt this narrative where all of these trolls sort of flock to Black and Indigenous folks and try to spew all this hate. You can intervene and do that. You can fight the narrative. So those are just a few concrete things. The last thing I'll say is, I know I said that before, I don't know where this 10% number came from. I haven't heard any Black or Indigenous folks calling for 10%. So I call shenanigans on it right now, and you should do the same. Write to your city councilor, write to Josh Matlow and Kristen Longtan who put this motion forward, and ask them, where did you get 10% from? Because I literally have not heard anybody asking for that. People weren't marching in the streets going 10% defunding. That was not a thing. People are calling for the full defunding of the police as part of a larger abolitionist vision. So push for that.
Thanks, Phil. And Sandy, I wanted to get you to touch a little bit on what kind of issues it could pose going up against the police union when we want to talk about defunding the police.
I mean, the police union is an organization that is meant to protect the police from being held to any type of account for the type of injustices that they inflict on our community. Let's remember, after Abdi was beaten to death in public, that they started this campaign where they were wearing these bracelets to support Daniel Montesson, who was the one who beat him with knuckle-plated gloves on, right? They started this Thin Blue Line campaign that also exists here in Canada. They fight against any accountability measures that people try to implement. For example, when it comes to the Special Investigations Unit, the police can decide whether or not they want to participate in any investigations, and they often decide not to. And so the police union is extremely powerful. But what we can't allow to happen is for that police union to be more powerful than us. One thing that I think is so interesting is I have never seen the type of mobilization that we have seen worldwide right now happening. There are protests happening in Whitehorse, in Georgetown, in Victoria, all over Canada, all over the world. And the politicians are mighty quiet, no? Mighty quiet. you know, you'll have a few people talk about, you know, I don't know, we need to cut money here or there or whatever it is, like 5 white supremacists say something and then John Tory's like, let me respond, you know? But right now, there is such people power out on the street, and we're being ignored. I don't understand. And again, this just goes back to the devaluing of Black and Indigenous life in this country. However, they do know that they need to respond in some way, because otherwise we wouldn't be seeing what's happening on Friday, about to happen on Friday, which is Juneteenth, the anniversary of the abolition of enslavement in the United States. In Canada and the colonies, it's August 1st, but it's Juneteenth, so there's going to be a lot of actions all over the United States and Canada in solidarity, okay? And on Juneteenth, they are announcing that they are taking action, and that action that they are taking is more of the same. They know that they need to announce that they're doing something because this is so popular, so we need to keep it up. That is our power having an effect on such a powerful institution in society, so we need to keep that up. As Phillip was saying, we can depute at these meetings, and if that's one of the types of ways that you want to engage, maybe you're not going to go out in the street, maybe you're not going to call your counselor, you should call your counselor, or you know, however else you want to engage. The deputations are actually virtual, so you don't have to go in. You can do them from the safety of your home. And finally, one thing that I just want to make sure that we do not forget is the province has a lot of responsibility here. It looks like they're skirting a lot of that responsibility. Haven't heard a lot from the province either. The province has more control over the police budget than the city of Toronto does, and a lot of people probably don't know that. So I know, just a few months ago, people were saying, hey, Doug Ford doing so great on COVID. What a guy, okay? Let's actually take stock of what this guy is doing, okay? He is allowing this type of thing to continue, and he is being mighty silent right now. So let's not forget where power lies.
Thank you so much, Sandy. And we're pretty much at the end of the time that we have tonight. But I do want to throw, since we're talking a little bit more in the Toronto context, I want to throw it back to you again, Sandy. Since so many people here in the audience are looking for concrete steps and tangible actions that they can do now to make sure that defunding the police moves forward and how they can support. And you mentioned a few of them already, but I wanted to know if you have any more advice for people.
Yeah, I'll hail up what Phillip has said, join an organization. There are, you see all of the exciting things that organizations do, but let me tell you, there's a lot of boring stuff in the background too that may excite some of the nerds out there like myself. I was rounding off all of these numbers today because, that's one of the things that I like, looking at numbers and getting folks who are doing research together to help put that type of stuff together. Also, we exist in so many different pockets of already organized people that we might not think I exist in an organized setting. If you're taking a class right now, that's an organized setting. Ask your professor if perhaps you can address the class beforehand because you have some ideas or something that you learned and you just want to share it with the class. Or ask the professor to share a link with the class with more information. If you are part of a faith group, and you're regularly attending some sort of faith congregation, ask if you can be a part of sharing some information and directing people to different organizations that have, who are active on this issue. If you're at work, if you're part of a union, demand that your union take a position. If you're part of OPSU, demand that your union kick the police union out of their union. If you are a part of an organized situation, make sure that the people in your family, your faith-based congregation, wherever it is that you're engaged in an organized manner, make sure that people know where those resources are. I am so excited to see so many people on this call. That means that we can connect with so many other people and give them this information, because as I say, power knows that they have to move right now because we have shown how much power we have right now. And if we continue to grow that, they are not going to be able to ignore us. They have voted to dismantle the police in Minneapolis, y'all. Dismantle the police. 1 month ago, that wouldn't have been possible. Okay, in cities across Canada and across North America, people are submitting motions to reduce budgets by 30%, 50%, and so on. Like this is the time that our policymakers should be listening to us, and they're not. So we have to do more. We have to continue to do more.
And quickly before we go, Dr. Palmater, do you have any other concrete actions that you would advise people that they could start taking?
Well, aside from self-education and being loud about resisting all of this police violence, I would say really think about where your money's going. Your tax money, whether it's sales tax, income tax, property tax, cigarette tax, gas tax, that all goes to funding the police to kill Black and Indigenous peoples. So take some of your income and put that to Black and Indigenous peoples and our community groups, not big national political groups, but our community groups to help us save our lives. And I think that's a much worthwhile investment than continuing to pay the police to do these things to us.
And Cheryl, do you have advice on what people can do, what kind of action people can take now?
I think the moment is now. The power is in the people. Please, challenge all those narratives about, the communities being the problem. The problem is human rights violation by those that we put in power and in authority. So please challenge those negative narratives. The time is now. Racism is a public health issue now. It's been passed. So let's do it now. The COVID, hashtag has been, we're in this together. Let's do it together. Our lives depend on it.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. And I want to thank each and every one of you all for taking the time to come and deliver this webinar to over 2,000 people in the city. You're all fantastic, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your experience, and all of you, really. Thank you.
Yes, I want to thank our terrific moderator, Angelyn, and all the amazing panelists for their contributions, their passions, and the stories that they shared and the knowledge. I know I learned a lot, and we all learned a lot, and the buck doesn't stop here. We don't just take this and learn it and keep it to ourselves. We have to go out. We have to speak to our friends, our family, challenge our politicians, those who are in power, because right now is the moment to take action. And there are so many different ways that different people on this panel have outlined, and really encourage everyone to follow their work. We really do want to urge you to contact your city councilor, contact the mayor, tell them to vote to defund the police and actually invest in communities, and make sure that all communities are safe, because it's clear that the police aren't keeping communities safe. They're not keeping Black and Indigenous communities safe. They're criminalizing poverty. We need to get at the root issues. So help. And then once you do take action, tell your friends and tell your family to take action too. And it could look like posting it on Facebook or Instagram, but also it could look like actually messaging them and calling them and asking them to take action and following up with them. Because we're all organizers, we all have such amazing communities around us, and we have to make sure we're the solidarity work continues. I want to thank everyone for joining us, everyone on Zoom, on Facebook, on Twitter. Please share this amazing video with your friends and your family on your feeds, and let's get the word out there, because today's now is the time to take action. Like Sandy said, none of this would have been possible a month ago. So we live right now in I think an exciting time, although it's extremely traumatic and sad. But we have an opportunity to build the world we actually want, that actually values everyone's life. Thank you so much to everyone who's joined. I know a lot of folks are concerned about where they can get the recording. They can get it on our Facebook, on our Twitter, and on our website. Thank you, and have a great night. I do want to thank all our panelists once again, and our amazing moderator. And thank you for donating to the Black Youth Fellowship. We've raised so much money for such an amazing, initiative that's going to change what power looks like, and that's what we're talking about tonight.